The chandeliers glittered like captive constellations above the ballroom, their fractured lights scattering across polished marble and silken gowns, illuminating a world that thrived on spectacle and quiet cruelty. Laughter rippled through the crowd in soft, measured waves, each note carefully shaped to charm, to impress, to conceal. Yet beneath that elegance, something sharper stirred, whispers that slithered from fan to fan, from lip to ear, until they found their chosen victim and clung there like frost. Lady Eliza Hartwell stood at the edge of it all, as though she had been painted into the scene and then forgotten. Her gown, though tasteful, seemed deliberately modest against the sea of extravagance, its pale blue silk refusing to compete for attention. She held herself with a stillness that might have been mistaken for composure, were it not for the faint tightening of her gloved fingers around her fan, or the careful way she kept her gaze lowered, not in submission but in defense. Once she had belonged to this world. Once her name had been spoken with admiration, her future considered certain, even enviable. That certainty had dissolved with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind only the brittle remains of expectation. Now her presence did not inspire admiration but curiosity, and not the gentle kind. No, hers was the sort that demanded answers, that delighted in scandal, that feasted upon the smallest hint of disgrace. "Poor thing," someone murmured, not nearly quietly enough. Eliza heard it, of course. She heard everything. The rustle of skirts shifting just slightly away from her. The deliberate turning of shoulders. The quick, assessing glances that flickered across her face and then vanished, as though she were something unpleasant glimpsed in passing. Her mother stood a short distance away, engaged in strained conversation with an acquaintance who smiled too brightly and listened too little. There was a desperation in Lady Hartwell's posture, in the way her laughter arrived a fraction too late, as though she were attempting to stitch together a reputation already torn beyond repair. Eliza felt the weight of that effort like a silent plea pressing against her ribs. It had not always been so. There had been a time when her name was spoken alongside another, when her future had seemed not only secure but chosen. He stood across the room now, resplendent in tailored black, his posture as confident as ever, his smile as practiced. Beside him stood his new fiancée, radiant in ivory and adorned with the effortless assurance of a woman who had never known doubt. Their eyes met briefly. Eliza's breath caught, though she did not move. For a moment she thought, absurdly, that something might flicker there. Regret, perhaps. Or memory. There was nothing. Instead, he turned away with the ease of a man discarding an unimportant thought. A moment later she heard her name spoken again, this time accompanied by a soft, indulgent laugh. "I assure you," he was saying, his voice smooth and untroubled, "there was never anything of consequence. A youthful misunderstanding, nothing more." The words settled over her like ash. A youthful misunderstanding. Eliza felt the room shift, though nothing had physically changed. The air seemed thinner, the light harsher. Around her, the whispers sharpened, no longer speculative but satisfied. There it was, the explanation they had been waiting for. Not tragedy, not betrayal, but something smaller, more humiliating. She had not been wronged. She had been mistaken. Her grip tightened just once before she forced her fingers to relax. She would not give them the satisfaction of visible distress. She had learned painfully that dignity was not granted in such rooms. It had to be carved out, quietly and without witness. Still, something inside her trembled. "Lady Eliza." The voice was unfamiliar, low and steady, cutting through the murmur of the crowd with quiet authority. She turned, compelled despite herself, and found a gentleman observing her with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. He was not close enough to be intrusive, yet not distant enough to be accidental. There was something in his expression, something unreadable, that held her in place. Before she could respond, a sudden movement to her left startled her. A pair of ladies, passing too quickly, brushed against her shoulder. It was a small thing easily dismissed, yet in that moment, fragile as she was, it was enough. Her balance faltered. The world tilted just slightly, the polished floor seeming to rise toward her with merciless clarity. She braced herself for the inevitable, the stumble, the gasp, the final indignity of becoming a spectacle. It never came. A hand closed firmly around her arm, steadying her with unyielding precision. The contact was immediate, decisive, and entirely unexpected. For a heartbeat she could not breathe. "Careful, Lady Eliza." The voice was close now, impossibly so, its low timbre resonating through her like distant thunder. She lifted her gaze, drawn by something she could not name, and found herself caught in the unrelenting focus of a man she knew by reputation long before she knew his face. The Duke of Ravenscroft. Alexander Ravenscroft was not a man one encountered lightly. His presence alone seemed to alter the atmosphere, bending it subtly to his will. He was not conventionally charming. There was no easy warmth in his expression, no practiced affability. Instead, there was something sharper, something that suggested restraint not as a virtue but as a necessity. His hand remained at her arm, steady, unwavering. "Society delights in a fall," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "but I do not." The words were quiet, yet they carried, threading through the surrounding noise with unsettling clarity. Eliza became acutely aware of the silence that followed, of the way nearby conversations faltered, then ceased altogether. Eyes turned, curiosity reignited with renewed vigor. The Duke had spoken to her. More than that, he had intervened. Eliza felt the heat of their attention, the weight of unspoken questions pressing in from all sides. This was not kindness. It could not be. Kindness did not arrive in such a form, did not carry such consequences. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt, though softer than she intended. "You are most uninclined to watch injustice masquerade as entertainment," he interrupted, his tone measured, though there was an edge beneath it that made her pulse quicken. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with deliberate care, he released her arm. The absence of his touch was immediate, leaving behind a strange, disorienting awareness of what had just occurred. He inclined his head, a gesture of formal politeness that did nothing to diminish the intensity of his presence. Around them, the silence began to fracture, whispers returning with renewed urgency, sharper now, more dangerous. Eliza should have stepped away. She should have retreated, reclaimed the fragile distance that had once protected her. Instead, she found herself rooted in place, her gaze still drawn to his, as though something unspoken had passed between them, something neither of them had acknowledged. Across the room, her former betrothed watched, his expression no longer indifferent. And for the first time that evening, the whispers changed. They were no longer about her disgrace. They were about him. And that, Eliza realized with a sudden, sinking clarity, was far more perilous. Morning arrived in a hush of pale gold, yet the quiet of the Hartwell residence did little to soothe the unrest that lingered beneath its carefully ordered surface. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching on polished wood and faded portraits, illuminating a household that clung to dignity as though it were the last fragile thread holding everything together. Eliza sat near the window, her posture composed, her expression serene, yet her thoughts moved in restless circles, returning again and again to the moment that had altered the course of the previous evening. The Duke's voice had followed her into sleep and returned with her upon waking, low and deliberate, impossible to dismiss. It was not merely what he had said, but how he had said it, as though each word carried intention beyond its surface meaning. She had been defended, yes, but not with the casual gallantry of a gentleman seeking admiration. There had been something sharper in it, something that suggested he had chosen that moment with unsettling precision. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a maid entered bearing a small parcel upon a silver tray. The object itself was unremarkable at first glance, neatly wrapped, tied with understated care, but there was something in the way the maid held it, something almost cautious, that drew Eliza's attention at once. "This was delivered for you, my lady," the girl said, placing the tray upon the small table beside her. No name was given. Eliza's fingers hovered for a moment before she reached forward. Anonymous gifts were not unheard of, yet under present circumstances, nothing could be considered ordinary. The house itself seemed to hold its breath as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the paper with measured care. Inside lay a book. Its leather cover was worn in a manner that spoke of age rather than neglect, its spine bearing a title she recognized at once, though she had not seen it in years. Her breath caught, quiet but unmistakable. It was a rare volume of poetry she had once admired in passing, mentioned only briefly in conversation long ago, at a time when her words had carried no consequence. She lifted it gently as though it might dissolve beneath her touch. As she opened the cover, something delicate slipped free and fell into her lap. A single white rose, pressed carefully between the pages, its petals preserved in fragile perfection. There was no note, no signature, only the silent certainty that this was no accident. Eliza closed the book slowly, her thoughts shifting, rearranging themselves around this new and troubling mystery. Few would have remembered such a detail, fewer still would have acted upon it. And of those, only one possessed both the means and the audacity to deliver such a gesture without explanation. Her pulse quickened, though she willed it otherwise. No, she told herself firmly. could not be so simple. Yet even as she resisted the thought, it refused to be dismissed. The following days unfolded with an unsettling rhythm, each one marked by a quiet intrusion that blurred the boundary between coincidence and intention. A bouquet appeared one afternoon, its flowers arranged with deliberate restraint, as though designed to be noticed only by the one who understood them. A piece of music she had once favored was performed at a gathering, its melody threading through the room with an intimacy that felt almost personal. And always there was him. The Duke did not seek her out openly, nor did he avoid her. Instead, he existed within the same spaces, his presence neither accidental nor overt, as though he moved according to a pattern known only to himself. When their paths crossed, his gaze lingered a moment longer than propriety allowed, not in impropriety but in recognition. It was enough to unsettle her. Society of course noticed everything. The whispers that had once circled Eliza alone began to shift, widening to include a new and far more compelling subject. Speculation bloomed with renewed vigor, each version of the story more elaborate than the last. Some insisted the Duke sought amusement at her expense, that his interest was a calculated cruelty designed to entertain himself at her cost. Others suggested something far more dangerous, that he intended to attach himself to her in a manner that would defy expectation and invite scandal of the highest order. Eliza heard it all. She bore it with the same quiet composure she had cultivated since her fall, yet beneath that surface something unfamiliar stirred. It was not hope, she refused to name it as such, but neither was it indifference. It was a tension that coiled within her, tightening with each passing encounter, each unspoken exchange. At the next gathering, the tension reached its inevitable peak. The ballroom was smaller than the last, yet no less suffocating in its scrutiny. Conversations faltered as she entered, then resumed with renewed intensity, as though her presence had provided fresh material to be dissected. Eliza moved through it with measured grace, her steps steady, her expression composed, though her awareness sharpened with every glance that followed her. She had resolved, upon arriving, to avoid him. It was a sensible decision, one grounded in reason and self-preservation. Whatever his intentions, they could not lead anywhere that did not end in further complication. She had endured enough of that. Yet resolve, she discovered, was a fragile thing. She saw him before he saw her. He stood near the far end of the room, engaged in conversation, his posture as composed as ever. There was nothing remarkable in the scene itself, nothing to distinguish it from any other moment of polite society. And yet, something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, as though the space between them had been marked by an invisible line. She turned away. It was the only reasonable course. A gentleman approached her then, one whose attentions had grown increasingly persistent in recent days. He bowed with practiced ease, his smile pleasant, his manner entirely appropriate. There was nothing objectionable in him, nothing that would invite scrutiny or disapproval. He spoke of trivialities, of weather and acquaintances, his tone light, his interest evident. Eliza listened, responded when required, allowed the conversation to proceed as expected. And yet she was aware, not of the man before her, but of something beyond him, something that pressed at the edge of her senses with quiet insistence. She did not need to look to know that the Duke had noticed. The realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "Lady Eliza," the gentleman was saying, his voice warm with expectation, "might I have the honor of the next dance?" It was a simple request. An ordinary one. She should have accepted. Before she could answer, another voice cut through the moment, low and unmistakable. "I believe that honor has already been claimed." The gentleman stiffened, his smile faltering as he turned. The Duke stood there, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on the man but on her. There was no apology in his manner, no attempt to soften the interruption. He had not raised his voice, yet it carried with absolute authority, leaving no room for dispute. The silence that followed was immediate, charged with something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Eliza's breath caught, though she did not allow it to show. This was no longer subtle. This was no longer deniable. And as the Duke extended his hand toward her, his eyes never leaving hers, she understood with sudden, inescapable clarity that whatever this was, whatever game he played or truth he concealed, he had no intention of allowing her to remain untouched by it. His hand remained extended, unwavering, as though the entire room had narrowed to that single, suspended moment. Eliza felt the weight of every gaze upon her, the sharp curiosity, the barely concealed anticipation, yet it was not the crowd that held her captive, it was him. There was no command in his posture, no outward force, yet refusal felt impossible, as though something deeper than propriety compelled her forward. She placed her hand in his. The contact was brief, formal, yet it sent a quiet, disorienting awareness through her, one she could neither justify nor dismiss. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her acceptance, then led her toward the center of the ballroom with measured precision. The movement parted the crowd as though guided by an unseen current, whispers trailing in their wake like shadows reluctant to release their hold. The music began. It was a waltz, slow, deliberate, designed to draw its participants into a proximate that burden intimacy. His hand settled at her waist, firm but not possessive, while hers rested lightly against his shoulder. The distance between them was proper, dictated by decorum, yet it felt perilously thin, charged with something unspoken that neither of them acknowledged. "You place yourself in difficult situations, Lady Eliza," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. The words might have been a rebuke, yet there was no accusation in tone, only a measured observation that unsettled her more than criticism would have. "I was not aware he had invited this one," she replied, her voice composed despite the tension coiling within her. "No," said his gaze steady, "you merely endured it." She faltered, just slightly before regaining her rhythm. The distinction struck deeper than she wished to admit. Endurance had become her habit, her shield against a world that seemed determined to test the limits of her composure. "And you," she returned, lifting her gaze to meet his, "seem determined to involve yourself in matters that do not concern you." A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, touched his expression, though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "On the contrary," he said, his voice lowering further, "I find that this matter concerns me very much." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Eliza's breath caught, though she forced her expression to remain unchanged. This was precisely the danger she had sought to avoid, the slow, inexorable drawing in of something she could not control. The dance carried them onward, each turn measured, each step precise, yet beneath the practiced movements, a tension pulsed, subtle but undeniable. She became acutely aware of him, the steadiness of his hold, the quiet intensity of his focus, the way his presence seemed to narrow her world to the space they occupied. When the music ended, the spell did not break. For a moment, they remained as they were, suspended between motion and stillness, as though neither had quite decided how to return to the expectations of the room. Then, with deliberate care, he released her. "Walk with me," he said, not as a request but not quite a command. Eliza hesitated. To refuse would be to draw attention, to invite speculation of a different sort. To accept was to step further into uncertainty. Yet even as she considered, she knew the decision had already been made. He led her from the ballroom without haste, his pace unhurried, his manner composed. The noise of the gathering faded behind them, replaced by the quieter atmosphere of the adjoining corridor. Here the light was softer, filtered through tall windows and flickering sconces, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step. They stopped near the far end, where the corridor turned and the distant sounds of music became little more than a muted echo. For the first time since the dance began, they were alone. Eliza turned to face him, the question she had held at bay pressing forward with renewed urgency. "This must end," she said, her voice low but steady. "Whatever it is you intend, it cannot continue in this manner." He regarded her in silence for a moment, his expression unreadable, as though weighing her words against something only he could see. "And what is it you believe I intend?" he asked at last. The question unsettled her more than she cared to admit. There was no mockery in it, no easy dismissal, only a quiet insistence that demanded an answer she was not certain she possessed. "I believe," she began carefully, "that you are a man accustomed to control, and that you have chosen to exercise it in a manner that places me at a distinct disadvantage." A faint tightening of his jaw was the only indication that her words had struck their mark. "You think this is about control," he said, his tone measured, though something beneath it shifted, deepened. "What else could it be?" she returned, unable to keep the edge from her voice. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he stepped closer. The distance between them vanished, the corridor narrowing to the space they shared. Eliza felt her breath catch as her back met the cool surface of the wall, not with force, but with an inevitability that left no room for retreat. He did not touch her, not yet, yet the proximity alone was enough to send a sharp awareness through her, one that demanded both caution and acknowledgement. "Look at me." The command was quiet, yet it carried an intensity that made refusal impossible. She lifted her gaze, drawn by something deeper than compliance, and found herself caught in the full force of his attention. There was no restraint in it now, no careful distance. Only something raw, unguarded, and dangerously close to desperation. "Say you do not love me," he said, his voice roughened by an emotion he no longer concealed. "If you can." The words struck her with the force of a revelation, shattering the fragile understanding she had constructed. For a moment she could not speak, could not think, her mind struggling to reconcile what he had said with everything she believed to be true. "This is absurd," she managed at last, though the words lacked conviction. "You cannot." "I can," he interrupted, the sharpness of his tone cutting through her protest. "And I have." The certainty in his voice left no room for dismissal, no refuge in disbelief. It was not a declaration made lightly, nor one offered for effect. It was something else entirely, something that had existed long before this moment, long before she had any reason to suspect it. "You do not understand," he continued, his voice lowering, though the intensity remained. "You think this began in that ballroom or with those gifts or even with your disgrace. It did not." Eliza's pulse quickened, her breath unsteady as she searched his face for some sign of explanation, some indication that this was not as impossible as it seemed. "Then when?" she whispered, unable to keep the question from escaping. For a moment, something softened in his expression, though it did not lessen the weight of what he was about to say. "You spoke to me once," he said quietly. "Years ago. You will not remember it. There was no reason you should." The words stirred something distant in her memory, a faint echo she could not quite grasp. "You were kind," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Without expectation. Without calculation. You saw me when no one else did." The realization came slowly, unfolding with a quiet, devastating clarity. And as it did, the world she had known shifted, leaving her standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than scandal. Something she could no longer pretend not to feel. Silence lingered between them long after his words had settled, as though the corridor itself had absorbed their weight and refused to release it. Eliza remained where she was, her back still pressed lightly to the wall, her breath uneven despite her effort to steady it. The world she had so carefully ordered, where affection was measured, where intentions were decipherable, had shifted into something far less certain and far more dangerous. "You mistake me," she said at last, though her voice lacked the quiet certainty it once held. "Kindness is not a promise. A passing moment does not bind a lifetime." His gaze did not waver. "It was not the moment that bound me," he replied, his tone steady, though the restraint within it felt strained. "It was what it revealed." Eliza shook her head, as though she might dislodge the growing sense of inevitability coiling within her. "You speak as though this is something immutable, something that cannot be altered by reason or circumstance. But it must be. It must be because anything else would be," she faltered, unable to name it without giving it power. "Unacceptable?" he supplied quietly. "Yes," she said, seizing upon the word. "Impractical. Ruinous. You are a duke, your grace. You do not entangle yourself in attachments that invite scrutiny and condemnation. Not for something so intangible." His expression shifted, not into anger but into something far more resolute. "You believe I am governed by the expectations of others," he said. "That I weigh my decisions against the approval of a room that would discard you without hesitation." "You must," she insisted, though the conviction in her voice wavered. "That is the world we inhabit. You cannot simply decide to stand apart from it without consequence." "And yet," he returned, stepping back at last, though the distance did nothing to lessen his presence, "I find that I can." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than any argument could have. It was not defiance for its own sake, nor reckless disregard. It was certainty, quiet, unyielding, and entirely at odds with everything she had been taught to accept. Before she could respond, the distant sound of footsteps broke the fragile stillness. Voices followed, indistinct but approaching, carrying with them the inevitable return of scrutiny. The moment, private, precarious, was slipping away. Eliza straightened, drawing what composure she could around herself like armor. "You should not have said what you did," she murmured, her gaze lowering briefly before she forced herself to meet his eyes once more. "Whatever you believe, whatever you feel, it cannot be allowed to continue. Not in this way." His jaw tightened, though his expression remained controlled. "And how would you have it continue?" "It should not," she said, the words sharper than she intended, though they did nothing to steady the turmoil beneath them. "It should end." The footsteps grew louder, the corridor no longer theirs alone. The world was returning, with all its expectations and judgments, pressing in from every side. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a quiet deliberation that felt more dangerous than any raised voice, He inclined his head. "As you wish, Lady Eliza." The formality of the gesture struck her with unexpected force, as though something vital had been withdrawn, leaving behind only the rigid structure of propriety. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps measured, his posture unyielding. Eliza remained where she was, watching him go, the echo of his presence lingering long after he had disappeared from view. The following days unfolded with a stillness that felt unnatural. The gifts ceased. The carefully timed appearances vanished. The subtle, undeniable thread that had drawn him into her orbit was severed so completely that it was as though it had never existed at all. Society, however, did not forget so easily. If anything, the absence only sharpened its curiosity. Whispers shifted once more, speculation evolving into something more pointed, more insistent. Had the Duke grown bored? Had he accomplished whatever purpose he had set for himself and moved on? Or had something passed between them that rendered further pursuit unnecessary? Eliza heard it all just as she always had. Yet this time the whispers found no easy place to settle within her. There was no relief in his absence, no sense of restored balance. Instead, there was a quiet, persistent awareness of what was no longer there, a space left unfilled that she could not ignore. She told herself it was for the best. That whatever had begun between them, however improbable, however compelling, had been destined to end in complication, in scrutiny, in the very ruin she had fought so hard to survive. And yet, the certainty she had once relied upon felt distant, as though it belonged to someone she no longer entirely recognized. It was during this uneasy quiet that her mother presented her with a solution. "He is a respectable man," Lady Hartwell said, her tone carefully measured, though the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. "His family is well regarded, his position secure. He has expressed a clear and sincere interest in you, Eliza. This is not an opportunity we can afford to disregard." Eliza sat in silence, her gaze fixed upon the delicate pattern of the carpet beneath her feet. She knew the man her mother spoke of. He had been attentive, considerate, entirely appropriate in his conduct. There was no fault to be found in him, no reason to refuse. No reason, save one she could not bring herself to name. "I will consider it," she said at last, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Her mother's relief was immediate, though it did little to ease the tension that lingered in the room. The next gathering was larger than any before it, its scale matched only by the intensity of the attention it drew. It was the sort of event where decisions were expected to be made, where alliances were solidified, where futures were quietly, irrevocably shaped. Eliza arrived with measured composure, her expression serene, her movements precise. She had resolved at last to do what was expected of her, to accept the path that had been laid before her, to secure what stability she could from a world that offered her little else. The gentleman in question sought her out quickly, his manner warm, his intentions clear. As they spoke, as he outlined a future defined by respectability and calm assurance, Eliza listened with the quiet attentiveness that had always been her strength. It should have been enough. It should have been exactly what she needed. And yet, as he spoke, she felt a growing sense of distance, as though she were observing the moment rather than inhabiting it. Then, without warning, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple through the crowd, a hesitation in conversation that spread outward like a disturbance across still water. Eliza felt it before she saw it, the unmistakable shift in attention, the quiet, collective awareness that someone, had altered the balance of the room. She did not need to turn to know who it was. But she did. The Duke stood at the entrance, his presence commanding without effort, his expression as composed as ever. There was no sign of the intensity he had shown her, no trace of the vulnerability he had revealed. He was, in every visible sense, the man society expected him to be. And yet, as his gaze found hers across the room, something in it burned with a quiet, unyielding resolve. He began to walk toward her. The gentleman beside her faltered, his words trailing into uncertainty as the reality of the moment settled around them. Conversation ceased, attention narrowing with almost painful focus as the Duke approached, each step deliberate, each movement carrying a weight that could not be ignored. Eliza's pulse quickened, though she forced herself to remain still, to meet his approach without retreat. He stopped before her, his gaze never leaving hers. Then, without acknowledging anyone else, without offering explanation or apology, he spoke. "You will forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying through the silence with effortless clarity, "but there is a matter that requires immediate resolution." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. And as the room held its breath, Eliza realized, with a sudden, undeniable certainty, that whatever he intended to do next would not merely alter her future. It would redefine it entirely. The silence that followed his words was not empty, but charged, as though the very air had tightened in anticipation of what must come next. Eliza stood motionless, her gloved hands clasped before her, though she felt none of their steadiness. Around her, the room seemed suspended between breath and heartbeat, every gaze fixed upon the two figures who now stood at the center of its attention. The gentleman beside her shifted, uncertain, his earlier confidence dissolving beneath the weight of the Duke's presence. "Your Grace," he began, his voice faltering despite his effort to maintain composure, "I believe Lady Eliza and I were engaged in a conversation that can wait," the Duke interrupted, his tone measured, yet carrying a quiet authority that left no room for dispute. He did not raise his voice, yet it cut cleanly through the man's protest, reducing it to something inconsequential. Eliza felt the heat of scrutiny intensify, the whispers gathering just beyond the fragile barrier of silence. This was no longer subtle. Whatever line had once separated private intention from public declaration had been crossed without hesitation. "You presume much, Your Grace," she said, her voice low, though steady enough to carry to him alone. His gaze softened, only slightly, yet enough that she felt the shift like a change in temperature. "On the contrary," he replied equally quiet, "I have delayed far too long." The words unsettled her, not for their boldness, but for the quiet certainty beneath them. There was no trace of doubt, no hesitation born of the audience surrounding them. Whatever he intended, he had resolved upon it completely. He turned then, at last acknowledging the room. "I will not detain you all with unnecessary speculation," he said, his voice carrying with calm precision, each word chosen with deliberate care. "But I find that silence, in certain matters, can be mistaken for indifference. That is an error I intend to correct." A murmur rippled outward, restrained yet unmistakable, as though the room itself struggled to contain its reaction. Eliza's pulse quickened, though she willed herself to remain still, to listen, to understand what he was about to do before it unfolded beyond recall. "You have spoken of Lady Eliza Hartwell," he continued, his gaze sweeping the gathered faces with quiet authority, with a familiarity that exceeds both accuracy and propriety. "You have reduced her character to rumor, her worth to speculation, and her future to a matter of convenience." Each sentence fell with measured clarity, stripping away the comfortable illusions upon which the room relied. No one spoke. No one dared. "That ends now." The simplicity of the declaration struck with greater force than any elaborate speech. It was not a request, nor a plea for reconsideration. It was a boundary drawn, unmistakable and unyielding. Eliza felt something shift within her, something she had long held rigid loosening with quiet, almost imperceptible force. For so long she had endured, had allowed herself to be defined by the absence of defense, by the silence that followed her fall. To hear her name spoken not with pity, nor dismissal, but with unwavering conviction, it unsettled her in ways she could not immediately comprehend. The Duke turned back to her then, the vast weight of the room receding as his attention narrowed once more to a single point. "I will not ask you to accept what I feel," he said, his voice lower now, though no less steady, "nor will I compel you to return it. But I will not permit you to be diminished while I remain capable of preventing it." Eliza's breath caught, her carefully maintained composure faltering beneath the quiet intensity of his words. There was no demand in them, no expectation beyond what he claimed for himself. It was not a bargain he offered, but a truth he refused to conceal. "You speak as though you alone may alter what has already been decided," she said, though her voice carried less resistance than before. "No," he replied, a faint edge entering his tone, "I speak as though I refuse to accept decisions made without merit." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a deliberation that seemed to echo through the stillness, he extended his hand once more, not as an assertion of control, but as an invitation, offered without guarantee of acceptance. "I intend to marry you, Lady Eliza." The words fell into the silence with quiet inevitability, as though they had existed long before they were spoken aloud. A collective breath seemed to draw in around them, the room teetering on the edge of something that could not be undone. Eliza stared at him, the enormity of what he had said reverberating through her with disorienting clarity. This was no private confession, no guarded admission offered in the safety of solitude. This was a declaration, irrevocable and absolute, placed before a society that would measure, judge, and remember. "You would bind yourself to scandal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried all the weight of her understanding. "To a reputation that cannot be restored by title alone." His expression did not change. "I would bind myself to truth," he said simply. The answer struck deeper than she expected, cutting through the careful reasoning she had constructed to shield herself. Truth. Not obligation, not strategy, not even desire alone. Something steadier, more enduring, and far more dangerous. "You do not know what you ask," she said, though the words felt weaker with each passing moment. "I know precisely what I ask," he returned, his gaze unwavering. "The question, Lady Eliza, is whether you know what you refuse." The challenge, softly spoken, settled between them with unmistakable force. Eliza felt the room press in once more, the countless eyes, the unspoken expectations, the fragile structure of a life she could reclaim if she chose the safer path. She thought of the quiet stability offered to her, the absence of risk, the promise of acceptance. And then she thought of this, of being seen, not as a mistake nor a cautionary tale, but as something chosen without reservation. Her breath trembled, though she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a steadiness born not of certainty, but of resolve. "You ask me to step into uncertainty," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "To abandon what little security remains to me in favor of something that may yet falter beneath the weight of consequence. I ask you," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less intense, "to decide whether security without truth is a life you can endure." The words lingered, echoing against the silence that followed. For a moment, Eliza closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had changed. Not in the room, nor in the man before her, but within herself, something that had long remained dormant stirring with quiet, undeniable force. She stepped forward. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, yet it carried with it the weight of a choice made not in haste, but in clarity. Her hand found his. The contact was no longer tentative, no longer bound by the fragile distance of uncertainty. It was a decision, deliberate and unyielding. "I cannot say that I do not love you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor that lingered beneath it. "Because it would not be the truth." The admission settled between them, fragile yet unbreakable, altering the space they occupied in ways that could not be undone. For the first time, the rigid control that had defined him faltered. It was not a grand reaction, nor a display meant for the room that watched them. It was something quieter, a release, a breath drawn after long restraint, a tension easing that had been held far too tightly for far too long. His hand tightened slightly around hers, not in possession but in acknowledgement. Around them, the room stirred, the silence fracturing into whispers that would, in time, reshape themselves into new narratives, new judgments, new expectations. But for that moment none of it mattered. Because for the first time since her fall, Eliza did not feel diminished. She felt chosen. And as the Duke of Ravenscroft inclined his head, not in formality but in quiet reverence, the world that had once sought to define her seemed at last to loosen its hold, just enough for something entirely new to take its place.